Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Richard. It's been really a very nice visit so far. And I'd like to emphasize what Tim mentioned. I'm at your disposal today, tomorrow. So if you'd like to chat, by all means, let me know. I'd be happy to do so. Okay, well, let's get started. Every few years, the church that I attend in Madison, Wisconsin sponsors a science and faith symposium. And it's a day-long symposium. The speakers are primarily academics from the University of Wisconsin and one or two places elsewhere. The audience is typically non-scientific and not necessarily academic, but it's a pretty good size audience, usually around 600 people. And I typically give the presentation on climate change. And it's very interesting to me. At the end of the day, we provide opportunity for people to provide comments on comment cards or go online now and provide comments. And the diversity of opinions on my talk on climate change never ceases to amaze me. One year, about 5 years ago, I got a marriage proposal, which my wife thought was tremendously funny. And I got a question or a comment questioning the legitimacy of my Christian faith. So both extremes from the very same talk. Another example of that is a couple of years ago, I gave a public lecture on climate change, and a Christian man that I know, an older gentleman, came up to me afterwards, and he said this: if you believe in climate change, you must have voted for Obama. And if you voted for Obama, you can't be a Christian. So why is it that this topic of climate change elicits such vitriolic, gut-level responses? Well, we'll touch on that just very briefly at the end of today's talk, and this is a bit of an advertisement if you can come to tomorrow evening's lecture, because we'll talk about it more then. But for today, the next 20 minutes, what I want to emphasize is, if I get my cursor's going here, is what the science says about climate change. Now, first of all, I have to say I am not a climatologist. So last year you had Catherine Hayhoe, who I know speak to you. She's a climatologist, I am not. I'm an ecologist, but for 25 years we've been studying what are the likely impacts of climate change on ecological systems, especially forest and forest ecosystems. So we're looking at anticipating the consequences of climate change for ecosystems. But having said that, I do pay attention a lot to the actual climate change literature, and I feel like I'm knowledgeable enough, at least, to talk to an audience such as today's. What I have to say about climate change can be summarized in 4 very simple points. It's real, it's us, it's bad, and there is hope. So that's the template for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Let's take a look at each of those. Climate change is real. The Earth's climate is changing. That the Earth's climate is changing is an unequivocal fact, at least to scientists. 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have occurred during this century. And it was just reported within the last week that in 2017, the oceans were the warmest they've ever been in human history. We can see a very brief video here that shows how the average temperature of the Earth has changed since 1950. Let's see if I can get this going. There we go. The warmer colors, of course, meaning warmer temperatures. And this stops at 2013. If we went up through 2017, they'd be even warmer. Or you can look at a historical trend, such as here, showing, yes, a lot of variation from year to year, and even decade to decade, but the upward trend is unmistakable. So the Earth is warming. There are many indicators that the Earth is warming. What are some of those? Well, science has documented over 26,000 indicators of a warming Earth. Things such as melting melting glaciers or reduced snow cover or tree lines shifting more to higher latitudes, springtime coming earlier, decreases in sea ice, increases in ocean heat content, increases in sea level, increases in sea surface temperature, increases in humidity. So thousands and thousands of independent indicators, all suggesting that the Earth is indeed warming. It's because of us. So scientists have studied many different contributors to climate warming. We've looked at solar radiation, looked at ozone levels, sulfate emissions, volcanic activity. All of them are plotted on this graph, and most of them are just kind of bouncing around without a very clear increase or decrease, with one exception. And that is this blue line, which is the release of greenhouse gases. And specifically, which greenhouse gas? Y'all know, right? CO2, okay, which is shown here. Here we see the increase, and an increasingly rapid increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere over the last 50 to 60 years. We've recently passed 400 parts per million, and there's no going back, at least in our lifetime. So let's take a look to see how temperature has fluctuated with CO2 levels over the last 800,000 years. So here we see CO2 levels. Here we see how temperature has tracked CO2 levels over these geologic ages. This is where we're at today. Actually, we've passed 400 parts per million, and this is what we can expect if we continue at this rate for the next till 2050. So a stunning increase in levels of CO2, at least with respect to the last 800,000 years. You might wonder, why hasn't temperature increased as rapidly as you might expect based on these? Well, we're experiencing this in a very, very narrow window of time. And given enough time, yes, the temperatures will shoot up. Even if we stopped emitting CO2 today, the temperature would continue to change for another 100 years into the future, because there are these long-term lag times, lag effects. It takes the Earth a while to catch up to the levels of CO2 in the environment. At this rate, we expect to blow by the 2-degree differential set in the recent Paris Climate Accord by about 2050. So only another 30 years or so. Now, people frequently ask me, so is the scientific community in agreement on this? And many different polls of scientists indicate anywhere from 97 to 100% agreement with the concept of human-caused climate change. And yet people still tend to resist that. And one of the things I like to ask them is, if you had 33 physicians telling you you had cancer, would you search around the world to find the one who would tell you you don't? But individual scientists are one thing. I think a better indicator of the attitude of the science community is actual science organizations. There are roughly 200 scientific agencies and organizations around the world that have published statements about climate change. Of those roughly 200, 198 of them concur with the concept of human-caused climate change. 3 of them are non-committal, and those happen to be geological organizations, which have some tie to oil and other fossil fuel resources. None of them are opposed. So 198 out of 201 agree with that concept. And that ranges from the World Meteorological Organization to the Royal Society of Canada. Now, the next point is that the consequences of climate change will be bad and potentially catastrophic. There have been many different reviews published over the last 20 years indicating this, that there will be consequences for human health, for economics, for forests, for agriculture, for the military. Everything about human society that we know is going to be touched by climate change. So let's take a very quick look at a few of these. Agricultural production and food security will be compromised. Natural ecosystems are already being compromised, whether it's due to the massive forest fires in western North America that we've been experiencing, or bleaching of coral reefs, or the very large outbreaks of bark beetles that we have both in the western US and in western Canada. All of those are linked to climate change. There are consequences for economics. The Stern report of 10 years ago suggested that unabated climate change will eventually cost the equivalent of 5 to 20% of the gross domestic product of the world every year. That's like having an ongoing world war continuously into the future. So we're talking very significant economic disruption. People oftentimes say, well, we can't afford to address climate change, but study after study after study has suggested that the economic impact will be worse than if we do something to abate it. Climate change is going to imperil human health, and here we see emergence of new diseases, the spread of malaria, which is already happening, increases in heat waves and air pollution. I grabbed this off the internet just this morning. Cape Town, South Africa, they're not looking forward to, they're anticipating running completely out of water by the first part of April. That's called Day Zero in Cape Town. And Cape Town's a city of 4 million people. So it's actually pretty severe. And unfortunately, these impacts will just disproportionately affect the poor. Here we see a graphic of total CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. This is now about 18 years old, but it still makes the point by country. So the darker the color, the greater the CO2 emissions. China has now surpassed the United States. And here we see the reciprocal graph of estimated deaths attributed to climate change. And you can see they are inversely correlated. So the countries that are emitting very little are the ones that are suffering the most. If you wonder why Canadians are not suffering from climate change, at least most of you, consider where would you lie on the worldwide economic spectrum. And that's certainly the case for the United States as well. Climate change imperils national security, has the potential for significant impacts on all three of the basic elements important to national and international security, being defense, diplomacy, and economics. So from a historical perspective, everything we know about human civilization, its economics, agriculture, technology, political structures, every societal construct you can think of developed under a stable climate system. And we've now left that system, and there's no going back, not in our lifetimes. So climate change will negatively impact nearly every realm of human activity. And those who are unwilling to engage with that reality simply will not understand the world of this century. So in response to this, we have three potential options. These have been outlined by a number of scientists, and they get batted around a lot. You've probably seen them. Three options for dealing with climate change. Mitigation, that is steps to reduce the magnitude and rate of climate change, so simply reducing it. Adaptation, steps to reduce the harm caused by climate change and suffering. Those are the three options. And it's not like we can choose one or another. All three of them are already happening, and all three of them will continue to happen into the future. But the question we have to embrace is, which one of these do we want more than the others? Because we can tip that triad in one direction or another. And ideally, we'll work towards sufficient mitigation that climate change is limited to a level with which we can cope, to which we can adapt. Yet there will be some suffering. And the key point here is that climate change is different from all other issues affecting society. If in the next 4 to 5 years, we don't address things like affordable health care, or racial justice, or human trafficking, or immigration, people will suffer and people will die. There is no doubt about that. But there will always be time to address those later. I'm not saying we should not address them now, but we can address them later. Climate change is different. If in the next 4 to 5 years we don't commit to a very significant decarbonization of human activity, it will be too late. That's what the science is telling us. We have a 4 to 5 year window to really begin effecting significant changes in human activities to decarbonize our world. And it's because of these long lag times that we have to anticipate that what we do now, the effects are going to be continued for decades or hundreds of years into the future, whether what we do now is good for the environment or bad. As James Hansen, previous climate director at NASA, has warned, failure to act with all deliberate speed functionally becomes a decision to eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. And Hansen has a reputation for being two things: alarmist and right. So that's what the science tells us. How am I, as a Christian, to respond? Well, I think it's helpful to look at this problem, as all others, within the arc of what God's doing throughout history. So let's remind ourselves of that. What are the major components of God's work in the history of the universe, of the world? Well, first of all, there's creation. God created a perfect world and charged humans to steward and care for it. The fall, humans rebelled, and that rebellion disrupted all of the created order. Redemption, but God had a plan, and that was a Savior to redeem not only people, but to redeem all of creation. And then restoration, the full restoration of everything back into proper relationship with God is not going to come until, we are told, Christ returns. But God has invited his people, his church, to be involved in that process now, to be part of his worldwide restoration project. So that's what God's doing in the arc of history. The implications for us are that to love God as creator means that I will steward and care for his creation. And to love God as a redeemer means I will participate in his work of redemption and restoration, that full ordering back into proper relationship, which we know as shalom. There are many, many different Christian denominations that have urged action on climate change. This is just a few of them here. But you might ask, okay, well, what about individual Christians? Where do they stand? Some interesting polling has shown these results. Polls confirm that there is a connection between our religious affiliation and our opinions about climate change. Mainline Protestants typically have opinions that are very similar to the American average. The more conservative the group, the more likely they are to deny climate change. In fact, 2/3 of white evangelicals are unconcerned about climate change. It's not surprising then that many people, especially liberals, especially people that I rub shoulders with all the time, view religion as a major root of climate denialism. But is it? So a number of sociologists have explored this question, and the answer is much more nuanced than you might expect. And what they've found is that it is actually not conservative theology that maps to climate denialism. Rather, it's conservative political ideology combined with age. So it's not being evangelical or conservative that makes people, or religiously conservative that makes people deny climate science. It's being politically conservative and old. So those are the traits that map to climate denialism. So I've painted a rather bleak picture of the future of our world. Unfortunately, I think it's an honest one. But we also have to ask ourselves, is there reason for hope? And I think there really is. At the worldwide level, there are many, many good things happening, even increasingly within the last 2 years. There's been the coming together of communities, of cities, of states and nations to combat climate change. The Paris Accord is just one very significant example. There have been commitments by companies, by places of worship, by schools, by other organizations to reduce their carbon footprints. There's been the massive deployment worldwide of renewable energy resources and reductions on the reliance on fossil fuels. There's been improved land management practices for the sequestration of carbon. So there's all kinds of good things going on. The question is, are they enough, and will they help reduce the suffering that we're going to experience into the future. And this being a Mennonite university, we have to also ask, well, what is the role of Christian hope? Is there anything that the Christian community can uniquely provide? And to be honest, that's a question that I struggle with a lot, and I don't have the answer. I have some insights, I have some ideas, and I'll share them with you. God certainly could rescue us from our own environmental undoing, but he may not. In fact, actually, he hasn't yet for the millions of people who are already suffering. So I like what Richard Buckham, the theologist, has written in his book, The Bible in the Contemporary World. And he makes the distinction between ultimate hope and proximate hope. Ultimate hope is that unconditional final achievement of God's purpose for all of creation, the full renewal of heaven and earth. And that's going to happen sometime into the future. But he says there's also this proximate hope, that is the conditional, the uncertain work toward betterment of the world now. And what he argues is that proximate hope should be realistic and discerning, as well as imaginative and creative. And I think that this is the hope that the Christian community has to offer here now in response to climate change. Whether it's mitigation or adaptation or reducing suffering, the Christian community should provide hope that is at once realistic and discerning, as well as imaginative and creative. And in some sense, I think this is what the Apostle Paul was talking about when he wrote these verses out of the book of Romans. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So, the shape of our moral universe does not naturally include social justice, environmental justice, intergenerational justice. Those are things that hopefully scientists who have strong moral standings, Christian or not, can deal with. And tomorrow night I'll talk a little bit more about the interface of science and morals. But that's what I feel that I feel uniquely as a person a calling to do, that activity at the interface of science and faith. So thank you, and happy to take some comments.